The world only ever saw his smile, the one that lit up cities, crowned by cameras and covered in grace. But behind that perfect smile, in the hush between breaths, lived her name, a name that never made it to the headlines but lived like prayer on his tongue. She wasn't a scandal, nor a forbidden love to be whispered about in corridors of gold. She was something quieter, deeper, the pause in his heartbeat that reminded him he was still human beneath the royal crown. He never hid her because of shame, but because the world was too loud for something so sacred. She wasn't a secret he buried in shadows, she was the silence he protected like treasure. Every time he stood before the world, every time the weight of titles pressed upon his shoulders, he carried her presence like a soft echo beneath his ribs. And when the world applauded his victories, he wished they could hear what his silence was trying to say, that all of it meant nothing without her. In the quiet of the desert nights, where the wind hummed stories older than time, he'd stand alone and let the stars listen to his heart. There, away from duty and eyes that watched too closely, he would speak to her, not through words, but through the rhythm of his soul. The dunes became his diary, the moon his confidant, and his silence the only language that could carry her name without breaking it. She understood him in ways the world never could. When he spoke, she listened beyond his words, she heard the weight behind them. When he fell silent, she knew it wasn't emptiness, it was reverence. Some loves are written in poems, others carved into marble. Theirs was etched into silence, each unspoken moment louder than any vow. She didn't need to be announced, she was already everywhere, in his pauses, in his sighs, in the gentle calm he wore after chaos. There were nights when the palace halls echoed too loud, and the laughter around him felt rehearsed. Those were the nights he missed her most, not for her touch, but for her quiet understanding. He didn't crave words from her, he longed for her silence, that stillness where his restless heart found peace. She had been the only one who didn't demand the prince. She wanted the man beneath the robe, the dreamer beneath the duty. He often wrote poems he never shared. Some ended with her name, others began with her memory. And though the world called him Fazza, the poet, the prince, the heart of Dubai, only she knew the voice behind those verses. She knew which poem was his confession and which was his apology. And when he read his poetry to the world, they heard art, she heard love disguised as rhythm. People often say silence is empty, but for him, it was full of her. It was the place where she still lived, untouched by time or distance. He could walk through 1,000 crowds, speak in 1,000 tongues, yet no sound could fill the space she left behind. His silence wasn't mourning, it was devotion. It was his way of keeping her close in a world that demanded distance. Every photograph of him smiling carried a trace of her presence. Every look in his eyes was a story the world would never read. She was in the way he looked at sunsets, in the way he wrote about rain. Even when surrounded by millions, he moved like a man who carried a secret melody, one too beautiful to be shared, one too delicate to survive noise. There were moments when duty called louder than love. He had to choose silence over confession, legacy over desire. But even as he bowed to the crown, he knew, she was his truest kingdom. The world could have his words, his charm, his victories. She alone had his silence, the only part of him that was entirely real, unfiltered, and eternal. Sometimes, in his poetry, her presence slipped through unintentionally, a metaphor too tender, a line too personal. Those who read closely might have wondered who inspired such ache, but he would only smile. For every word he gave to the world, he saved 1,000 unspoken ones for her. She had become his muse, his mystery, his endless stillness. Years passed, and the world moved on, but the silence never did. It followed him like perfume, like memory. He learned to live with it, not as absence but as echo, a reminder that some loves do not end, they just change form.
Sometimes, he would find himself standing at the edge of the royal balcony, staring into the endless horizon, where the sun melted into gold over the dunes. The air would taste of memory, and the desert wind would brush his face like her hands once did. He would close his eyes, and for a moment, he could almost hear her laughter, soft, unburdened, wild like the sands themselves. That sound was no longer real, but it lived inside his silence like a heartbeat. He wondered if she, too, could still feel the weight of his unspoken words wherever she was, if her nights were haunted by the same hush that now ruled his life. Every morning he faced the world with poise, his voice calm, his demeanor regal. But inside, he carried a desert storm only she could have calmed. His silence was misunderstood by many. They called it strength, when in truth, it was survival. He had built walls out of quietness, not because he wanted to keep the world away, but because he was still trying to keep her memory intact, untouched by noise, protected from time. To love in silence was his rebellion against a world that made everything loud, everything temporary. When he wrote now, his pen trembled with restraint. Each poem was a battlefield between what he could say and what he must never reveal. Her presence hid between the lines, her essence folded into metaphors, a desert bird, a whispering wind, a fading star. To the readers, it was poetry. To him, it was confession. Every verse he shared with the world was an act of remembering her without saying her name, of keeping her alive without letting her burn in the public eye. She had become his secret prayer, and his silence, her eternal shrine. Sometimes, in his solitude, he wondered if silence could speak louder than promises. Because when the world demanded answers he could never give, his silence became the only truth left. He had learned that love didn't always need to be spoken to be real. Sometimes it needed to be guarded, to be kept sacred beneath the layers of duty and fate. Theirs was never a story written in the stars, it was one carved quietly in the soul, unseen but unerasable. And though destiny demanded distance, silence gave them eternity. There were moments when the ache of her absence softened into gratitude. He realized that she had given him something no one else could, the ability to feel without fear, to love without need for possession. She taught him that silence wasn't emptiness but depth, a place where truth could breathe without being destroyed by words. He didn't lose her, he became her echo.